A division of property in Maryland or DC is generally done under what's called equitable principles. So, what is equitable, and does that not mean equal? Well, it does and it doesn't. So, here's what I mean by that. Equitable is what the court believes is in the interest, justice, and fairness of the situation. It is, after all, especially in Maryland, a court of equity. They want to make sure that both parties are going to be okay. And equal exactly 50-50 doesn't always do that. That doesn't mean that the equal 50-50 isn't really where the courts start. So if you have a house, generally, if it's been titled by tenants by the entirety, meaning it's been titled, as a married couple, the equity in the house is likely going to be divided equally. If the house is titled differently, then any equity that was put in during the marriage from marital assets and from marital resources is going to be divided equally. Any increase in a retirement account or a pension, the marital portion is likely going to be equally divided. There are some factors that might cause it to not be equally divided. Those might be if there is somebody in the marriage who is disabled, or somebody in the marriage that has significant resources outside of the marriage, meaning if they have a family trust that they are getting money from that is non-marital resource, the court might take some of those things into consideration and some of those factors. Another thing is fault. If somebody has dissipated marital assets, meaning they have spent them outside of the marriage for benefits that have nothing to do with the family, that also might go into a division of assets. So what do? We divide them equitably. You start with equal, and then you check to see if there are any of those extra factors that maybe cause things to not be exactly equal. All right, so you're getting divorced and you have to divide the assets. Do you divide them equally or equitably, and what the heck is the difference? Well, equally is pretty simple. You take the orange, you slice it down the middle, each you walk away with a half the orange. So what is equitable distribution? Well, Maryland divorce court is a court of equity, and a court of equity is looking at more than equal. They're looking at what is fair. They're looking at what is reasonable, and they're looking at what's going to meet the needs of this particular couple and this particular family. They're also looking at any other factors that might play in. Let me give you an example. One opportunity for a court to look at something and not divide it exactly equally is if one party is going to walk away with very small amount of assets, very de minimis assets after a long-term marriage, and the other party has a significant trust fund worth multiple millions of dollars that's non-marital. Well, after the marriage, they're going to walk away with pretty different lifestyles. A court might consider that. Not definitely will, but might. Another opportunity for the court to consider something is if somebody is disabled or doesn't really have the ability to earn money in the same way. A court might look at that and go, you know what? They're going to have really different opportunities after the divorce. Maybe we need to do something differently. Another opportunity that a court might look at to say, hey, maybe equal isn't particularly right in this circumstance is if there is marital fault. If somebody had cheated and spent significant amounts of resources on a non-party to the marriage, that might factor in. Or let's say it's not even a case of infidelity. I had one case where somebody, unbeknownst to their spouse, was sending significant funds to their family overseas without their spouse having any idea or any information. That also can be dissipation, because even though it's family, it's not the family of the marriage, and it wasn't with the consent of both spouses. So these are some opportunities, and there are more for a court to look at an equal distribution and go, we got to adjust this a bit. There are multiple opportunities for how you divide your house or your cars in a divorce. I'm going to start with the house. There's the easy one. The court can order it sold and the proceeds equally divided. That's usually the easiest way, but it doesn't always serve the family. In Maryland, if there are children, one thing that could happen is something called use and possession, where one of the parties who has the children with them can get use and possession for up to 3 years, meaning they get the opportunity to stay in the house and maybe even get contribution to the expenses for the house from the other party, and then the house will be sold. Another opportunity is that the court could assign a house, especially depending on title, to one party or the other, family use, personal property, and make sure that to balance the equities in another way. That doesn't happen as often from what I've seen, but it is an opportunity. What is important is that both parties are compensated for the equity that was created during the marriage. So what happens to cars? Well, cars also can easily be ordered sold, and that's it. Sold, proceeds divided. Or The court can look at the current value of each vehicle. Not just the current value, not just like the KBB Blue Book value, but you have to look at the KBB Blue Book value and also what is owed on the car. So what is the actual value of the car once any liens are paid off and the car is sold? The court can then look at that value and say, okay, husband's car is worth $3,000, wife's car is worth $10,000. So to balance the equities, we're going to do what's called a monetary award and shift some money from something else, maybe dividing a savings account or something else over into husband's pot. That's one opportunity that a court can do to, again, make sure that these parties still get to keep their cars, but we're balancing the equities. So lots of opportunities. The easy default, sell, split the proceeds. But you can also get creative and figure out other ways so that the house or the cars can stay in the family. The division of retirement accounts is exceptionally interesting in the DC area. Why? Because we have so many service members and we also have so many people that have worked for the federal government. And then separate from that, we have a lot of people who have international jobs working for the IMF or the World Bank. And all of those come with some pretty unique opportunities to save for retirement. That also means some pretty unique things that we sometimes have to divide. So the general rule of thumb is that any portion of your retirement, whether it's a pension, a 401k, a TSP, any of those things are going to be divided equally, the marital portion. We do that in a formula where we take the number of years of marriage, we divide by 2, but it's over the course of the amount of time served. It's a whole formula. They call it the Banks formula in Maryland. It has different names in different places. But what it results in is figuring out exactly how much of that pension or of that retirement account should go to the spouse that doesn't have the title in the account. Now, this can get really tricky. You got to make sure that you have a lawyer that knows what they're doing, especially when it comes to military pensions and military retirement, because there's also the disability factor. And when you get a disability rating, that goes into how much of the money that you're receiving in retirement is considered disability and how much of it is in straight retirement, because those are treated very differently in a divorce. You also have to look at the different types of pensions, because right now we still have a lot of people who are under the old pension system and some people under the new pension system. And there are unique rules for how those are divided. Looking at TSPs. TSPs are a unique savings vehicle, a thrift savings plan for those of you who don't work a federal government job. But those also have to be divided with a unique particular court order to make sure that it happens. So bottom line, we're going to divide equally the marital portion. Also bottom line, if it's a pension, your spouse is going to get it if, as, and when you get it. And last but not least, please make sure that you work with a qualified family law attorney if you have any of these. These are not DIY divorces. These are complicated, qualified domestic relations orders to make sure that it is done right and to make sure that both of you get what you deserve. So there are multiple different kinds of debts when it comes to marriage, and some of them in Maryland are divided and some of them are not. If they're a debt tied to a marital asset, something like a car, a loan on a car, or the mortgage on your house, well, that's going to be divided because it's going to be paid off as something is sold. But what about credit card debt or student loans or things like that? Maryland isn't getting involved in those. Not at all. That is between you and the creditor, and they're not going to make the creditor do anything in particular. And that's a really tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. So if you are a family that has a lot of debt, a lot of consumer debt, credit card debt, student loan debt, personal loans, this is one thing that I recommend is to be really talked about in mediation. Tax debt is another one to deal with. So how are debts divided? Well, that's between you and your creditor and whose name you put it in. Now, can debt be considered in other ways, kind of that X factor when they're considering division of assets? Yes, especially if the debt was incurred to benefit the family. But a court's not going to say, hey, credit card company, you can only go after wife for this much and after husband for this much. They don't get involved. Oh, business owners going through a divorce. You guys are my favorite to work with. I own a business. I understand how complicated it is. You have a lot of people who rely on you, not just your family that relies on your income, but also your employees, your vendors, everybody else that requires on you generating income. And when you're going through a divorce, especially if you started your business during your marriage or your spouse co-signed a loan, well, that's an asset that the court has to figure out how to potentially divide. Now, here's how this works. For the most part, there are exceptions. If the business is only in your name, the court is not going to be able to portion off parts of it and just give it to your spouse. So that part, at least for the most part, is safe. But what about what I said? What if your spouse is a cosigner? What if you put up your joint house as collateral for a business loan or for something else? Or what if in any way your spouse was an employee? Or what if they just volunteered at your business? All of that can go into account. And this one's hard, your spouse is likely entitled to half of the value of your business. So what the heck is the value of your business? Well, first, you got to get a business valuation, and there's a bunch of different types. So you got to look for the one that is going to give you the best opportunity to make the arguments you want and also aligns with your business. So once you have the value of the business, you have to figure out how to pay out that to your spouse, half of that. So what does that mean? Sometimes that might mean giving more equity away from your house. That might mean giving more in retirement assets. Or, and this one, the one that really stinks the most, it might mean selling off a portion of your business, adding in a partner, something like that, so that you have money to pay that out. I've seen it happen over and over again. It doesn't matter what type of business you're in. So how do you avoid that type of really harsh result? Well, number one, prenup. Number two, postnup. When you're starting that business, postnup. But if the ship has sailed on both of those, the biggest thing that you can do is any kind of divorce pre-planning that you can think of. So if you are a business owner or you're a spouse of a business owner and you're thinking about a divorce, talk to a divorce attorney soon. There are certain things that you can do to get ready, and I'm not talking about screwing over your spouse or, doing anything underhanded, but you can start to set up some of those things. If your spouse is a cosigner on a loan, maybe look for a different cosigner, or maybe figure out how to have a different asset be collateral. Start to set some of those things up in advance to make your divorce process a lot smoother.